73-year-old Elijah Morgan's last-ditch effort to save his son's failing farm by digging up an unproductive field uncovered a Civil War-era chest containing documents that exposed a centuries-old land theft conspiracy orchestrated by the region's wealthiest families, a discovery that brought national media swarming to their dying town, triggered a dozen historical investigations, and transformed a forgotten rural community into a landmark for justice that would forever change. How America confronts its hidden history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer drought had turned Clearwater Valley into a wasteland of cracked earth and withered crops. Robert Morgan, a third-generation farmer at 48, stood at the edge of his failing fields, calculator in hand. The numbers confirmed his fears. Without a miracle, the Morgan family would lose the farm that had been their home for nearly a century. "No sense waiting on rain that ain't coming," Robert muttered, pocketing the calculator as his father emerged onto the farmhouse porch. At 73, Elijah Morgan moved slower these days, but his lean frame still carried the determined posture of a man who had faced down hardship his entire life. "Thinking about that western section again," Elijah called out. The western section had frustrated 3 generations of Morgans, 8 acres that stubbornly refused to produce no matter what they tried. In prosperous years, they could ignore its poor yields. In a crisis like this, those unproductive acres meant the difference between survival and foreclosure. "I'm thinking about bringing in the excavator," Robert replied. "Dig deep enough to find whatever's wrong with that land once and for all. If we're losing the place anyway, might as well solve the mystery before we go." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Been wanting to do that since your grandfather's time. Never had the equipment or the desperation." He smiled grimly. "Now we've got both." 2 days later, a rented excavator arrived on a flatbed truck, its yellow arm bright against the dusty farmyard. Though Robert had experience from his construction days, Elijah insisted on taking the first shift. "Been wondering about that land for 60 years, the older man said, climbing up to the operator's cab with surprising agility. "I've earned the right to find out first." By mid-morning, Elijah had carved a 6-foot trench along the western edge of the problematic section. Robert was beginning to question their desperate gamble when his father's voice crackled urgently over the walkie-talkie. "Robert, get over here now!" Sprinting across the parched field, Robert found his father staring intently into the excavated trench, the machine's engine silent. "Look at that," Elijah said, pointing towards something embedded in the wall of clay approximately 5 feet below the surface. "That's not natural." Robert slid down into the trench, his heart racing as he approached what appeared to be the corner of a rectangular wooden object protruding from the densely packed soil. Carefully, he began clearing away the surrounding clay with his hands, revealing the unmistakable outline of an old chest. "Dad!" he called up, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's some kind of box or chest. Old, really old." For the next hour, father and son worked methodically to free the mysterious object. The chest was remarkably well preserved, thick oak with weathered but intact iron banding and a substantial padlock. It was heavy, requiring both men and a rope to lift it from the trench. "Civil War era, I'd guess," Elijah commented, brushing clay from the intricate keyhole. This land would have been right on the edge of the Mason plantation back then. As they loaded the chest onto Robert's pickup, his 17-year-old daughter Amelia arrived home from her summer job at the local historical society. Her eyes widened at the mud-covered artifact. "Grandpa, Dad, what is that?" she exclaimed, immediately documenting the discovery with her phone. "That's what we're about to find out," Elijah replied, his weathered face animated with an excitement Robert hadn't seen in years. "Let's get it to the barn, where we can open it properly. What the Morgan family couldn't know as they transported their discovery across the drought-stricken farm was that this forgotten chest would soon expose secrets deliberately buried for over 150 years, revelations that would not only challenge the established history of Clearwater Valley, but ultimately transform the economic foundation and social fabric of a community that had been slowly dying for decades. As Elijah positioned the chest on a workbench in the family barn, he was simply hoping to find something of historical interest, perhaps valuable enough to provide temporary financial relief. He had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks, his discovery would trigger multiple investigations, attract national media attention, and begin unraveling a centuries-old conspiracy that had shaped land ownership throughout the region since Reconstruction. The simple act of digging on underperforming farmland was about to expose how powerful families had systematically manipulated land records, diverted water resources, and concealed rightful ownership claims. A revelation that would not only save Morgan Farm, but fundamentally transform understanding of property rights throughout Clearwater Valley and beyond. "Got the toolbox," Robert announced, returning with equipment to address the rusted lock. "Should we call someone official before opening it?" Amelia was already texting her supervisor at the Historical Society. "Mrs. Harriman says we should document everything carefully, but there's no legal requirement to notify authorities for discoveries on private property unless we find human remains." Elijah nodded decisively. "Then let's see what's been hiding under our farm for a century and a half." As Robert positioned tools to break the ancient lock, none of them could possibly anticipate how completely this moment would transform not just their family's future, but the understanding of their community's past and the path forward for a place that had seemingly run out of both history and hope. As the lock finally gave way with a dull crack that echoed through the barn, 3 generations of Morgans held their breath. Elijah slowly raised the heavy lid, revealing contents that had remained untouched since before the Morgans, or anyone still living, had walked this earth. Nestled inside were stacks of yellowed documents, maps with unfamiliar boundaries, and a leather-bound journal with a name stamped in faded gold on its cover. "Frederick Douglass," Amelia whispered, reading the name with wide eyes. "Grandpa, do you know what this means?" The discovery that would change everything had only just begun to reveal its secrets. "Frederick Douglass," Amelia repeated, her hand trembling as she reached toward the leather journal. "We need to document everything exactly as we found it." She quickly set up her phone on a tripod to record video, while carefully photographing each item in its original position. The chest contained 3 distinct layers of contents. The leather journal lay atop a collection of carefully folded documents, beneath which rested several rolled parchment maps secured with faded ribbon. "Careful with that paper," Elijah cautioned, as Robert gently lifted the journal. "That's nearly 2 centuries old." Robert carefully placed the journal on a clean cotton towel Amelia had spread on the workbench. The binding cracked softly as he opened to the first page, revealing elegant handwriting in faded brown ink. "Journal of account regarding Negro settlement lands in Clearwater Valley as documented for the Freedmen's Bureau," Robert read aloud, his voice growing increasingly incredulous. "Commissioned by Frederick Douglass, July 1867. The Freedmen's Bureau was established after the Civil War to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom," Amelia explained, her historical society training evident. "They help negotiate labor contracts, establish schools, and sometimes allocate land." Elijah was carefully examining one of the maps. "This shows property divisions completely different from anything I've ever seen," he said. "Look at this. The western section of our farm is marked as part of a larger tract called New Promise Settlement, I've never heard of any settlement there." As they continued documenting each item, the outlines of an extraordinary historical revelation began to emerge. The journal, written by a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Isaiah Freeman, detailed the establishment of a settlement of freed people on land that included the western section of what was now Morgan Farm. Most critically, it documented how local officials and planters had systematically undermined the settlement through legal manipulation, redirecting the natural spring that had once made the land fertile. "Listen to this," Robert said, carefully turning pages of the journal. "Judge Harlan Mason and Mr. Everett Crawford have devised a scheme to render the new promised lands untenable through diversion of the western spring. They have altered county water rights records and constructed a channel redirecting flow to their remaining properties, claiming all southern adjacent lands as watershed protection areas." Amelia was examining what appeared to be legal documents. "These are land deeds," she confirmed, "original deeds showing ownership by freed families named Jackson, Turner, and Washington. But there's also documentation of court decisions that appear to have invalidated their claims through some kind of watershed conservation act." "The western section has never had proper water," Elijah said, the decades-old mystery suddenly clarifying. "We've always assumed it was natural, poor drainage or underground structures, but according to this, someone deliberately diverted the water away from that land almost 150 years ago. And not just anyone," Robert added, pointing to a name in the journal. "Harlan Mason, ancestor of Richard Mason, who owns half the county today, including Clearwater Estates and the water company." As darkness fell, the Morgan family had carefully catalogued the chest's contents. 23 original land deeds, 7 maps showing the original settlement boundaries, the detailed journal documenting the systematic dismantling of the freed people's community, and most damning of all, letters between prominent local families explicitly discussing their strategy to reclaim the lands by manipulating water rights and legal processes. "This isn't just history," Amelia said, the implications dawning on her. "If these documents prove that water was illegally diverted and land claims were fraudulently invalidated, it means the legal basis for current ownership could be questioned." Robert finished, understanding the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Elijah sat heavily on a nearby stool, the weight of the discovery evident in his expression. The Masons, the Crawfords, the Whitfields, these families still own most of Clearwater Valley. Their fortunes were built on this land. "We need expert help," Amelia insisted, already typing on her phone. "Professor Daniels at the university specializes in Reconstruction-era legal history, and Mrs. Harriman at the Historical Society has connections at the state archives. We should be careful who we tell," Robert cautioned. "These documents directly challenge the legitimacy of property rights for the most powerful families in the county. These papers have been buried on our land for a century and a half," Elijah replied firmly. "That chest was waiting for someone honest enough to bring its truth to light. I'm not dying with this knowledge buried again." The next morning, Professor Lenora Daniels arrived at the Morgan farm with archival preservation materials and a specialized scanner. As a leading expert on Reconstruction-era property law, she recognized immediately the historical significance of their discovery. "This is extraordinary," she confirmed after several hours examining the documents. "The journal alone would be remarkable, but combined with these original deeds and the explicit correspondence between these families, this is unprecedented documentation of how Reconstruction-era land redistribution was systematically undermined." "What does it mean for current ownership?" Robert asked. The practical farmer focused on immediate implications. "Legally complex," Professor Daniels admitted. "These documents certainly prove that water was deliberately diverted to make the freedmen's settlement untenable, forcing them to abandon legally deeded land, and the evidence of collusion between judges and wealthy landowners is unambiguous. Could descendants of the original deed holders have valid claims? Amelia wondered. Possibly, the professor acknowledged. At minimum, these documents reveal that the western section of your property was deliberately rendered unproductive through illegal means. The water rights, at least, could potentially be restored through legal challenge. As Professor Daniels continued digitizing the documents, Elijah received an unexpected call from Harold Thompson, editor of the struggling local newspaper. "Mr. Morgan," Thompson began excitedly, "I'm hearing rumors that you've discovered something significant on your property. Any comment about a historical chest?" Elijah looked questioningly at Professor Daniels, who nodded encouragingly. "We've found some historical documents that might change our understanding of Clearwater Valley's past," Elijah replied carefully. "We're working with experts to understand their significance." What the Morgan family couldn't anticipate was how quickly this cautious confirmation would spread beyond their small community. By evening, 3 regional news outlets had picked up the story, each version growing more dramatic than the last. Harold Thompson's careful article titled "Historical Discovery on Morgan Farm May Shed New Light on Local History" had morphed into "Civil War Treasure Unearthed. Documents May Challenge. Prominent Families' Land Claims" on a state news website. As Robert turned off the local news broadcast that evening, the family's phone began ringing continuously. Reporters, historians, and curious neighbors all sought details about their discovery. Most concerning was a message from Richard Mason, the current patriarch of the Mason family and chairman of Clearwater Development Corporation. "Mr. Morgan," his voicemail began with practiced cordiality that barely masked underlying tension. "I understand you found some items of historical interest on your property. As our families have been neighbors for generations, I'd appreciate discussing this privately before any further public statements. I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding any artifacts discovered." The implied pressure was unmistakable, confirming the family's instinct that their discovery had touched powerful interests. As they debated their next steps, Amelia's phone chimed with a notification that made her gasp. "Someone posted images of the documents online," she reported, scrolling through her feed. "Mrs. Harriman must have shared them with her historical society network. They're already being analyzed and shared by historians across the country." What had begun as a private discovery on a struggling farm was rapidly becoming a public conversation about historical justice and present-day consequences, one that would soon bring national attention to Clearwater Valley and force a long-overdue reckoning with buried truths that powerful interests had worked for generations to keep hidden. 3 days after opening the chest, the Morgan family awoke to find 5 news vans parked at the end of their driveway. What had begun as a local curiosity had exploded into regional news after Professor Daniels shared preliminary findings with colleagues at the State Historical Society. The professor's careful academic assessment that the documents represented potentially significant evidence of systematic land appropriation during Reconstruction had been transformed by media coverage into bombshell discovery challenges elite families' right to land. "This is getting out of hand," Robert said, pulling the kitchen curtain closed against the distant cameras. "We need to be careful about how we proceed." Elijah watched the scene with a mixture of concern and resolve. Truth was buried on our land for a reason, son. Maybe it was waiting for a time when it could finally be heard. The phone rang again, the 15th call that morning. This time, Amelia answered, to find an unfamiliar voice identifying himself as James Washington from Atlanta. My family has been researching our ancestors from Clearwater Valley for 3 generations, he explained, his voice carrying barely contained emotion. We always had oral history about land that was taken, but no documentation. When I saw those deeds online with my great-great-grandfather's name, Samuel Washington, I booked the first flight out. I'll be there tomorrow if you're willing to meet. He wasn't alone. By evening, the Morgans had received calls from descendants of 5 families named in the original deeds. Each shared similar stories of ancestors who had spoken of land in Clearwater Valley that had once been theirs, claims dismissed for generations as unprovable family legends. Meanwhile, the document's rapid spread online had caught the attention of Dr. Marcus Jenkins, director of the African American History Institute at Howard University. His team had already begun cross-referencing the chest's contents with Freedmen's Bureau records in the National Archives. The authentication is conclusive, Dr. Jenkins confirmed during a video call with the family and Professor Daniels. These documents match official records in our archives, including correspondence referenced in the journal. What makes this discovery unprecedented is the explicit documentation of how legal mechanisms were weaponized to undermine land rights that had been properly established. As academic validation strengthened the historical significance of their find, the local power structure was mobilizing in response. Richard Mason III had called an emergency meeting of the Clearwater Valley Business Association, which included the owners of the local radio station and weekly newspaper. That afternoon, the Morgans received an unexpected visitor. Harold Thompson, the newspaper editor, arrived looking uncomfortable but determined. "I've been instructed to stop coverage of your discovery," he admitted bluntly, after declining an offered glass of lemonade. Richard Mason reminded the paper's owners about our advertising contracts with Mason Enterprises and Clearwater Developments. "They're trying to bury this again," Elijah observed, unsurprised. "They don't understand what they're up against," Thompson replied with unexpected resolve. "I've already sent the full documentation to the State Tribune and 2 national outlets. This isn't just a local story anymore." He was right. By nightfall, a producer from a national news magazine had called requesting an exclusive feature, and a prominent civil rights attorney had offered pro bono services to help the family navigate the complex legal implications of their discovery. "We need to be strategic," advised Professor Daniels, who had temporarily relocated to a local bed and breakfast to continue working with the documents. "The historical significance alone merits preservation and recognition, but the potential legal implications for current property rights require careful handling." The next morning brought another unexpected development. A small group had gathered at the end of the farm driveway, not reporters, but local residents holding handmade signs reading "Support the Morgan family" and "Clearwater Valley deserves the truth." Amelia recognized Teresa Rodriguez, her former high school history teacher, among the supporters. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what's happening?" "Word's spreading about how the Mason family is trying to suppress your discovery," Teresa explained. "Many of us have watched this community decline for years, while the same families control everything from water rights to development approvals. People are connecting historical injustice to present inequality." Inside the house, Robert was on the phone with their bank manager, discussing an unexpected development. "So you're saying the foreclosure proceedings have been paused?" he asked incredulously. "May I ask why?" "Direction from regional headquarters," the manager replied cryptically. "Your farm situation has been flagged for special review in light of emerging historical considerations. Unofficially, no one wants to be the bank that foreclosed on property involved in what might become a landmark historical justice case." As the Morgans adjusted to their rapidly changing circumstances, James Washington arrived from Atlanta, accompanied by his cousin, Dr. Evelyn Washington, a legal historian specializing in property law. Their meeting in the farmhouse kitchen carried profound emotional weight as James carefully held the original deed bearing his ancestor's signature. "My great-grandmother told stories about this place until the day she died," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "She described a spring near a stand of oak trees that made the land special. Everyone thought she was confused or exaggerating, but she was describing exactly what's documented here." Dr. Washington was examining the maps showing the original settlement boundaries. "The water diversion described in the journal explains why the western section became unproductive. According to these documents, a natural spring was deliberately channeled away from the settlement lands." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "That spring still exists on Mason property now. It feeds the lake at Clearwater Estates." By evening 3, more descendant families had arrived in town, creating an unprecedented gathering of people connected by historical injustice finally brought to light. The local diner, typically quiet on weeknights, was filled with conversations about history, justice, and potential futures. While the human connections were forming in Clearwater Valley, the documents themselves were creating ripples through academic and legal circles. Dr. Jenkins had organized an emergency symposium at Howard University, bringing together historians, legal scholars, and civil rights experts to discuss the implications. "The Morgan Farm discovery isn't just about one community," he explained to a packed auditorium, his presentation streaming live online. "These documents provide the clearest evidence yet of how legal mechanisms were systematically used to undermine black land ownership during Reconstruction, with consequences that persist to this day in property distribution, wealth inequality, and resource access." Back in Clearwater Valley, the Morgan family gathered around their kitchen table with James Washington, Professor Daniels, and civil rights attorney Catherine Lewis to discuss next steps. The immediate financial pressure on the farm had eased, but the larger implications required careful navigation. "Based on these documents, we can pursue several legal avenues," Attorney Lewis explained. "Restoration of water rights at minimum, potentially recognition of historical claims with financial settlements. The evidence of judicial misconduct and conspiracy is especially significant." "We're not looking to displace anyone or create division," Elijah emphasized, "but this community has suffered from concentrated control of resources for generations. If these documents can help rebalance that legacy, they've emerged at exactly the right time." The discussion was interrupted by an urgent call from Harold Thompson at the newspaper. "You should turn on the national news," he advised without preamble. "They're covering the story, and they've uncovered something else." As the family turned on the television, they were stunned to see Clearwater Valley featured in the opening segment of a major news broadcast. The reporter stood at the entrance to Clearwater Estates, the exclusive development built around the diverted spring. "Behind me is the water source at the center of a historical revelation that has shocked this community," the reporter explained. "Documents discovered in a buried chest have exposed how this spring was illegally diverted 150 years ago to undermine land granted to formerly enslaved people. But our investigation has uncovered something equally significant. County records showing this same water source has been contaminated with industrial chemicals for the past 20 years, a fact concealed from residents while being documented in private environmental assessments commissioned by Clearwater Development Corporation. What had begun as a historical discovery was rapidly expanding to encompass present-day environmental justice, creating an unexpected alliance between historical Preservation advocates and local environmental activists who had long questioned the region's water quality. The chest buried on Morgan Farm had not only preserved evidence of historical injustice, but inadvertently triggered a modern investigation that was revealing continuing patterns of resource manipulation and public harm. As the national broadcast continued, security cameras captured Richard Mason III, leaving his office to face a growing crowd of protesters and reporters. His carefully crafted image as a community benefactor was crumbling under the weight of both historical and contemporary revelations, and the Morgan family's simple act of honestly sharing what they'd found was reshaping power dynamics that had remained unchallenged for generations. By the end of the week, Clearwater Valley had transformed from a dying rural community into the epicenter of a national conversation about historical justice, environmental accountability, and the persistent legacy of Reconstruction-era land policies. The Morgan Farm, once facing imminent foreclosure, had become an impromptu historical site with scholars, descendants, and media representatives arriving daily. "Never thought I'd see the day when people would line up to visit our farm," Elijah remarked, watching another tour group being led by Amelia and Professor Daniels to the site where the chest had been unearthed. The State Historical Society had dispatched a team to properly excavate the area surrounding the original discovery, uncovering foundation stones from what appeared to be several structures, physical evidence of the settlement described in the documents. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed the original route of the diverted spring, confirming the deliberate nature of the water redirection. Meanwhile, the environmental revelations had triggered an emergency meeting of the county commission, where residents demanded answers about water contamination. Attendance was so high that the meeting had been moved to the high school gymnasium. The documents found by the Morgan family opened a door not just to our past, but to present-day concerns that have been systematically ignored, declared Teresa Rodriguez, now emerging as a community organizer. "We demand full disclosure of all environmental testing and immediate remediation of contaminated water sources." Richard Mason III sat stone-faced on the commission panel, his usual commanding presence diminished by the unprecedented public challenge. When he finally spoke, his attempt to minimize the situation only heightened tensions. "These historical documents, while certainly interesting, have no bearing on current property rights established through decades of legal precedent," he insisted. "As for water quality concerns, Clearwater Development has always complied with all regulatory requirements." The gymnasium erupted in disagreement. Dr. Evelyn Washington approached the microphone, her academic authority silencing the room. "Mr. Mason, I've reviewed the documents extensively as a legal historian," she stated firmly. "They establish clear evidence of fraudulent judicial proceedings specifically designed to invalidate legally granted land rights. As for compliance with regulatory requirements, the environmental assessments now being made public show your company specifically requested testing parameters that would technically satisfy regulations while deliberately avoiding detection of known contaminants." The confrontation marked a fundamental shift in community power dynamics. For generations, the Mason family's statements had been accepted without question. Now, their authority was being publicly challenged by experts who could match their influence. With documented evidence, that evening, the Morgans received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Crawford, granddaughter of Everett Crawford, mentioned in the journal and current head of the local Historical Preservation Society, arrived alone at their farmhouse. "I needed to speak with you directly," she explained, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. "There's something you should know, something not in those documents, but passed down through my family." Once seated at the kitchen table, Sarah revealed a startling family secret. "My grandfather kept a personal journal that described not just the water diversion, but a second phase of their plan. After forcing the freed families off the settlement lands, the Mason and Crawford families discovered the original deeds had been buried somewhere on the property to protect them from destruction. They searched extensively, but never found them. So, our discovery wasn't just important historically, Robert realized. It exposed exactly what they tried to hide. "There's more," Sarah continued. "My grandfather's journal mentioned that Judge Mason specifically ordered the western section to remain undeveloped, claiming agricultural concerns. But the real reason was their fear that construction might unearth the buried documents." Elijah processed this revelation slowly. So the reason that land never produced well wasn't just the diverted water. It was deliberately left untouched to keep these documents buried. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "For generations, influential families here have known something was buried that could threaten their position. When your excavator broke ground, Richard, Mason received multiple calls from family members who remembered the old warnings. This explained the immediacy and intensity of Richard Mason's response to their discovery. What the Morgans had unearthed wasn't just historical evidence, it was documentation that powerful families had actively worked for generations to keep buried. The following morning brought another significant development. National coverage had attracted the attention of the Department of Justice's recently established Historical Reparations Task Force, created to address systematic property theft and discrimination. 2 representatives arrived to meet with the Morgan family, descendant families, and legal experts. "These documents present one of the clearest cases we've encountered," noted Justice Department Attorney Michelle Richardson, after reviewing the materials. "The explicit conspiracy to divest legally deeded landowners through judicial misconduct and resource manipulation is extensively documented. Add to that evidence that this conspiracy continued across generations to actively conceal these facts, and we have grounds for significant action." While legal processes began taking shape, the community impact continued expanding. Local teacher Teresa Rodriguez had organized Clearwater Valley's first-ever community history project, bringing together longtime residents, descendant families, and students to document both historical injustices and community resilience. "This isn't just about what was taken," she explained during a community meeting at the church. "It's about recognizing the continued strength of families that persevered despite these obstacles, and creating a more honest foundation for moving forward together." The project had unexpected effects on community relationships. Elderly residents who had never discussed racial history openly were sharing family stories that complemented the documented evidence. Young people were connecting historical patterns to present-day inequities they had observed but never understood. The buried chest had triggered not just legal processes, but community conversations that had been suppressed for generations. 10 days after the discovery, Richard Mason III requested a private meeting with the Morgan family. After considerable discussion, they agreed to meet on neutral ground at Professor Daniel's university office with legal representatives present. When Mason arrived, his typical confident demeanor had visibly faltered. The past week had brought not just public challenges, but internal family conflict, as younger Mason family members, uncomfortable with the revelations, had publicly distanced themselves from their grandfather's defensive position. "I've come to propose a resolution," Mason began stiffly. "While I maintain that current property rights are legally secure, regardless of historical circumstances, I recognize the significance of these documents and the importance of acknowledging past wrongs." His proposal revealed how dramatically circumstances had shifted. The Mason Foundation offered to establish a substantial community restoration fund, finance the rehabilitation of the original spring to restore water to the western section of Morgan Farm, and donate land for a historical memorial and education center documenting the New Promise settlement. This gesture, while appreciated, addresses only part of the issue, Attorney Lewis responded. The descendants of original deed holders have legitimate claims that must be properly addressed, as does the environmental contamination documented in your company's internal records. The negotiation that followed demonstrated the new balance of power created by historical truth finally coming to light. For the first time in Clearwater Valley's modern history, the Mason family could not simply dictate terms. Evidence, expertise, and public attention had created accountability that wealth and influence could no longer overcome. By evening, news broadcasts were reporting a historic agreement being negotiated to address both historical injustice and current environmental concerns in Clearwater Valley. What had begun with Elijah Morgan's desperate attempt to understand unproductive farmland had evolved into a process that promised to reshape not just one community, but potentially establish precedent for similar cases nationwide. As cameras captured Richard Mason leaving the university building, a reporter called out the question that had dominated recent coverage. "Mr. Mason, will you publicly acknowledge your family's role in diverting water and invalidating the freedmen's land claims?" Mason paused, visibly struggling with a question no one would have dared ask weeks earlier. His carefully crafted response, "Historical documents reveal actions by my ancestors that do not reflect values I wish to defend or perpetuate," marked a seismic shift in community power dynamics. Back at the farm that evening, the Morgan family gathered on their porch as the sun set over fields that held both new promise and old secrets. Television crews had finally departed, leaving them a rare moment of quiet reflection. "Did you ever imagine digging up that field would lead to all this?" Robert asked his father. Elijah gazed thoughtfully across the land his family had worked for generations, now understood in an entirely new context. "I just wanted to know why that land wouldn't grow," he replied. "But maybe some truths stay buried until exactly the right time for them to emerge." What none of them could fully appreciate yet was how their discovery would ultimately impact not just Clearwater Valley, but communities across the country where similar historical injustices had shaped present realities. The buried chest had set in motion conversations, investigations, and processes of reconciliation that would continue expanding long after the initial media attention faded. The next morning would bring more descendant families, more historians, and the beginning of a formal archaeological survey. But for tonight, 3 generations of Morgans sat together, watching fireflies emerge over fields that had suddenly become not just farmland, but living historical ground, a place where buried truth had finally found its way into the light. 6 months after Elijah Morgan unearthed the buried chest, Clearwater Valley had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The dying rural community, once losing population and economic vitality with each passing year, had become a center for historical research, reconciliation initiatives, and a new model for addressing long-buried injustices across rural America. On a crisp autumn morning, Elijah stood at the edge of the western section, land that had frustrated his family for generations. Workers were completing installation of a sophisticated irrigation system that would restore the natural water flow patterns documented in the chest's maps. Archaeological teams had carefully excavated the foundations of the original New Promise settlement buildings, revealing the precise layout described in Isaiah Freeman's journal. Hard to believe it was buried here all this time. Robert remarked, joining his father to observe the transformation. Not just the documents, but the whole settlement history. Elijah nodded reflectively. Sometimes truth waits for the right moment to be heard. The discovery had not only saved the Morgan farm from foreclosure, but had fundamentally altered its purpose. While they continued growing traditional crops on the eastern sections, the western acreage was being developed as the New Promise Historical Center, a living museum where visitors could learn about Reconstruction-era land policies, the establishment and undermining of freed people's communities, and the continuing impact of these historical events on present-day rural life. The Morgan family home, once facing foreclosure, now hosted the administrative offices for the center. The barn where they had first opened the chest had been carefully preserved and transformed into the main exhibit hall, displaying the original documents in specialized preservation cases alongside oral histories from descendant families. Most significantly, the legal settlement negotiated in the months following their discovery had established the Clearwater Valley Restoration Trust, a foundation funded by the Mason family and other descendants of those implicated in the historical documents. The trust provided support for education, economic development, and environmental remediation throughout the community. The governor's car just turned onto the main road, Amelia announced, checking her phone as the family prepared for the day's ceremony. In the 6 months since their discovery, she had deferred college plans to serve as the Historical Center's first program director, working with academic partners to develop educational materials now being adopted by schools throughout the state. Today marked the official dedication of the New Promise Center and the signing of the Historical Truth and Reconciliation Compact, a groundbreaking agreement between descendant families, current community members, and state officials to address both historical injustices and present-day inequities. "Never thought I'd host a governor on our farm," Robert mused, straightening his tie. The family had refused multiple offers to sell their story rights to film producers, insisting that the focus remain on the historical significance rather than their personal experience. The ceremony site transformed what had once been their least productive field into a gathering place for healing and recognition. Wooden benches arranged in concentric circles surrounded a central monument designed by a collaboration of artists descended from both the original settlement families and the wider community. The installation featured water flowing through stone channels that traced the original spring path, symbolizing the restoration of what had been deliberately diverted. By mid-morning, over 500 people had gathered for the dedication. National civil rights leaders sat alongside local farmers, descendants of the original New Promise settlers, now including 37 families who had been located through genealogical research, were seated in a place of honor. Most notably, younger members of the Mason and Crawford families attended separately from Richard Mason III, signaling their commitment to acknowledging truth rather than defending family legacy. Professor Daniels had coordinated an academic symposium, coinciding with the dedication, bringing together historians, legal scholars, and social scientists to discuss the broader implications of the Clearwater Valley discovery. Their preliminary findings, published in a special journal issue, documented how the patterns revealed in the chest's contents were repeated in countless communities nationwide. The Morgan Farm documents provide unprecedented evidence of mechanisms that were likely replicated throughout the post-Reconstruction South, noted the introduction co-authored by Professor Daniels and Dr. Jenkins. These findings fundamentally challenge conventional historical narratives about land distribution and wealth-building opportunity in rural America. As the ceremony began, Elijah was asked to speak first, an honor he had reluctantly accepted after encouragement from descendant families who considered his act of truth-telling the catalyst for long overdue recognition. "I'm just a farmer who," wanted to understand why a piece of land wouldn't grow right. He began simply, his weathered hands gripping the podium. What we found buried in that field wasn't just papers and maps. It was truth that had been deliberately hidden, truth that changes how we understand not just our past, but our present. He gestured toward the western section, where archaeological work continued. For generations, my family worked this land without knowing its full story. We struggled with that western section, never understanding why it refused to produce. Now, we know it wasn't failing. It was bearing witness in the only way it could, waiting for someone to look deeper. James Washington spoke next, representing descendant families. Over the past months, he had relocated to Clearwater Valley permanently, accepting a position as historical director for the center. My great-grandmother told stories about this place, that people dismissed as fantasy, he recalled, emotion evident in his voice. She described the spring, the oak grove, the sense of promise this land once held. Today, we honor not just those who received these deeds, but their resilience in preserving their story through generations, even when documents were buried and physical evidence was erased. The governor's address acknowledged the state's complicity in historical injustices, announcing new legislative initiatives inspired by the Clearwater Valley discovery. These included funding for similar investigations in other communities, educational mandates for more accurate historical curricula, and legal mechanisms to address documented cases of historical property theft. What happened here represents both our darkest history and our brightest possibility, she concluded. The courage to face uncomfortable truths creates the foundation for genuine healing and progress. Most surprising was the brief statement from Richard Mason III, whose public position had evolved considerably under pressure from both external accountability and internal family reckoning. After months of defensive legal maneuvers, he had finally acknowledged his family's historical role in undermining the settlement. The documents found on Morgan Farm exposed actions by my ancestors that cannot be defended or excused, he stated, careful but clear. While I cannot change the past, I commit to ensuring that the Mason family's future actions contribute to restoration rather than continuation of historical harms. This public acknowledgement, unimaginable 6 months earlier, demonstrated how, dramatically, power dynamics had shifted through the simple act of bringing buried truth to light. The ceremony concluded with the signing of the compact, representing the first legally binding agreement of its kind to address historical land appropriation through concrete commitments to education, economic opportunity, and resource restoration. Elijah Morgan and James Washington signed first, followed by the governor, county officials, and representatives from each stakeholder group. This signature acknowledges truth, but also commits to action, each signatory affirmed before adding their name to the historic document. As the formal proceedings ended, the gathering transitioned to a community celebration featuring displays of cultural traditions preserved by descendant families despite displacement, alongside local agricultural practices and crafts. What might once have been separate community events had become an integrated celebration of shared history, complicated and painful, but finally acknowledged. For the Morgan family, the day represented both culmination and beginning. Their farm had been saved not through conventional means, but through becoming something new, a place of learning, reconciliation, and honest confrontation with history. The western section that had frustrated generations of their family would now produce something more valuable than crops, understanding that could help heal similar divisions throughout the country. Did you ever imagine your digging would lead to all this? Teresa Rodriguez asked Elijah as they watched young people from descendant families interacting with local students beside the excavated settlement foundations. Never, he admitted. I just wanted to understand why that land wouldn't grow right. Never expected to dig up truth that would change everything. Beyond Clearwater Valley, the impact continued expanding. The Department of Justice Historical Reparations Task Force had established the Morgan Protocol for investigating similar cases nationwide. Historical societies in 7 states had initiated projects to identify patterns of land appropriation using methodologies developed through the Clearwater Valley discovery. Most significantly, public understanding was shifting as media coverage moved beyond sensationalism to thoughtful exploration of how buried histories shaped present realities. What Elijah Morgan couldn't fully appreciate as he watched the community gathering on his once failing farm was how his simple act of honest investigation had created ripples that would continue expanding long after media attention faded. The chest buried on Morgan Farm had preserved not just documents, but possibility. The possibility that acknowledging difficult truths could create foundations for more just futures. As sunset painted golden light across fields that had witnessed both historical injustice and present reconciliation, 3 generations of Morgans gathered on their porch alongside James Washington and other descendant family representatives. No cameras recorded this quiet moment of reflection. My grandmother said there would come a day when the land would tell its own story, James remarked softly. I never understood what she meant until now. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. The land had indeed spoken. Through unproductive fields that marked diverted water, through foundations that survived beneath the soil, and through a chest of documents preserved until the moment was right for truth to emerge. The failing farm that had driven a desperate attempt to understand poor soil had transformed into ground zero for a national reckoning with buried history. And the elderly farmer who had simply wanted to solve a practical agricultural mystery had become an unexpected catalyst for healing divides that had persisted for generations, proving that sometimes the most powerful truths are those that have waited longest to be heard. 3 years after Elijah Morgan unearthed the buried chest on his family's struggling farm, he stood in a place he had never imagined visiting, the East Room of the White House. At 76, the weathered farmer seemed an unlikely recipient of the Presidential Citizen's Medal, yet the citation being read captured exactly why his simple act of honest inquiry had earned national recognition. By bringing hidden truth to light and insisting on accountability regardless of power or privilege, Elijah Morgan demonstrated how ordinary citizens can catalyze extraordinary healing. The Morgan discovery, as it has come to be known, has transformed not just one community, but our national approach to historical reconciliation and justice. As the president placed the medal around his neck, Elijah thought not of cameras or ceremonies, but of the failing farm he had been desperate to save 3 years earlier. That crisis, painful as it had been, had driven the discovery that changed everything. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important truths emerge only when circumstances become desperate enough to dig deeper than convention allows. The White House ceremony represented public recognition of something that had been unfolding, quietly but powerfully across the country. What began as a local discovery in Clearwater Valley had inspired a movement for historical truth and reconciliation that was reshaping communities nationwide. The Morgan Protocol, as historians and legal experts now called it, had been implemented in 47 communities across 18 states. Each followed the pattern established in Clearwater Valley: meticulous historical documentation, inclusion of descendant communities, public acknowledgement of historical wrongs, and concrete commitments to address present inequities stemming from past injustice. As academic director of what was now called the National Center for Historical Reconciliation, headquartered at the new Promise Settlement site on what had once been the troublesome western section of Morgan Farm, Professor Daniels had documented the remarkable pattern of healing that emerged when buried histories were properly acknowledged. What makes the Morgan approach unique is its integration of historical truth, community participation, and concrete restoration, she explained to the assembled dignitaries at the White House reception. Unlike purely symbolic gestures or academic exercises, this model creates measurable change in community relationships and resource distribution. The tangible results were evident in communities like Riverbend, Mississippi, where long-hidden documents about post-Reconstruction land appropriation had been voluntarily brought forward by a family who recognized parallels to the Clearwater Valley discovery. Their decision had initiated a community-wide process of acknowledgement that ultimately led to the establishment of scholarship funds, business development programs, and environmental restoration initiatives specifically addressing historical harms. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a similar process had revealed systematic undermining of land grants to Black Civil War veterans. The subsequent Reconciliation Compact had created new educational institutions, community development corporations, and agricultural training programs designed to restore opportunities that had been deliberately blocked generations earlier. Robert Morgan, now serving as operational director for the National Center, had compiled data demonstrating how these initiatives were creating measurable economic revitalization in communities previously trapped in cycles of decline. By addressing historical injustice, these towns weren't just correcting past wrongs, they were unlocking new vitality and possibility. These aren't charity programs, Robert explained during a panel discussion following the White House ceremony. They're investments in community potential that was artificially suppressed through historical actions now being properly acknowledged and addressed. For Amelia Morgan, who had deferred but not abandoned her college plans, the discovery had shaped her educational path in unexpected ways. Now, studying law with a focus on historical property claims, she had helped develop legal frameworks for addressing similar cases nationwide. Her senior thesis, Buried Evidence, Legal Remedies for Historical Land Appropriation, had been published in the Harvard Law Review and was influencing policy discussions at the Department of Justice. What began with my grandfather's discovery has revealed patterns repeated in countless communities, she noted during the family's White House visit. When we acknowledge, rather than deny these histories, we create possibilities for healing that benefit everyone. Perhaps most remarkable was the transformation within Clearwater Valley itself. The community that had been losing population for decades was now experiencing modest but sustainable growth. The new Promise Historical Center attracted over 50,000 visitors annually, creating hospitality and service industry jobs. More significantly, the Restoration Trust had funded infrastructure development, educational programs, and small business initiatives that were rebuilding community vitality. The formerly underproductive western section of Morgan Farm, where water had been deliberately diverted generations earlier, now served multiple purposes. Part had been developed as the historical center, preserving archaeological evidence of the original settlement. Another section had been restored to agricultural production, using sustainable methods, providing training opportunities and fresh produce for local schools. Most symbolically, a portion had been converted to parkland surrounding the restored natural spring, a place where community gatherings and reconciliation events regularly occurred. What visitors found most moving was the Reclamation Garden, a space where descendants of both the original settlement families and those implicated in undermining their rights worked together to cultivate heritage plants documented in the Freeman Journal. This living exhibition represented the most powerful aspect of the Clearwater Valley model, the possibility of moving beyond accusation and defensiveness toward shared stewardship of both history and future. James Washington, now permanently settled, in Clearwater Valley with his family, had developed educational programs that traveled to schools nationwide. "We don't teach this history to assign blame," he explained to educators gathered at the White House event. "We teach it to understand how deliberately buried truths continue shaping present realities until they're properly acknowledged." The relationship between the Washington and Morgan families had evolved into something neither could have anticipated, a partnership in stewarding historical truth and creating new community possibilities. Their collaboration symbolized what was possible when historical divisions were addressed honestly, rather than perpetuated through silence or denial. Even Richard Mason III had undergone a remarkable transformation, though not without significant struggle. After initially fighting the implications of the discovered documents, he had eventually embraced a different role, using his influence to encourage other prominent families to acknowledge historical truths rather than defend indefensible legacies. His foundation now funded similar investigations nationwide, operating from the principle that communities are strengthened rather than threatened by honest reckoning with complex histories. "My family spent generations and considerable resources keeping certain truths buried," he acknowledged during a PBS documentary about the Clearwater Valley process. That energy could have been directed toward building something much more valuable, a community where everyone's history and contribution is recognized. As media coverage of the White House ceremony highlighted the national impact of the Morgan discovery, historians and social scientists were documenting a subtler but equally significant shift. Communities implementing the Morgan Protocol were demonstrating increased resilience against polarization and division. By creating structured processes for acknowledging difficult histories, these towns had developed capacity for addressing present challenges with greater mutual understanding and cooperation. What the Morgan discovery initiated wasn't just historical correction, but social medicine, noted Dr. Jenkins in his keynote address at the ceremony. Communities that honestly confront buried histories develop muscles for truth-telling and reconciliation that serve them in addressing current challenges as well. The evening following the White House ceremony, the Morgan family gathered with James Washington and Professor Daniels in a quiet moment away from cameras and speeches. They reflected on the extraordinary journey from crisis to transformation, not just for their family or community, but for a nation still struggling to reconcile historical injustices with present aspirations. "When I was digging in that field, all I wanted was to understand why the land wouldn't produce," Elijah remarked, the presidential medal now tucked away in his pocket. "Never imagined I was uncovering something that would help heal not just our farm, but communities across the country." "The land was speaking," James replied thoughtfully. "It just needed someone willing to listen." For communities across America implementing the Morgan Protocol, this willingness to listen to what the land and buried documents were revealing had created new possibilities for addressing divisions previously considered unbridgeable. By providing structured processes for acknowledging difficult truths, the approach had transformed historical reconciliation from abstract concept to practical community development strategy. What no one could have anticipated when Elijah Morgan first uncovered that buried chest was how many similar truths remained hidden in communities nationwide, not just in documents, but in landscape features, architectural anomalies, oral traditions dismissed as folklore, and agricultural patterns that hinted at deliberately altered landscapes. The National Center had documented over 300 communities, with evidence suggesting similar buried histories waiting to be acknowledged. Each represented not just potential historical correction, but possibilities for the kind of transformation Clearwater Valley had experienced. Economic revitalization rooted in honest acknowledgement of the past and collaborative investment in more equitable futures. As the Morgan family prepared to return home from Washington, Elijah visited the National Archives, where the original chest contents were now permanently preserved, alongside the most significant documents in American history. Seeing Isaiah Freeman's journal displayed near the Constitution and Declaration of Independence represented a powerful statement about which stories deserve inclusion in the national narrative. What began with one farmer's desperate attempt to understand poor soil conditions had evolved into something that was helping heal divisions in communities across the country. The chest buried on Morgan Farm had preserved not just historical evidence, but possibilities for reconciliation that had waited generations to emerge. As Elijah Morgan stood among visitors examining the documents he had discovered, he remained unrecognized, just an elderly farmer watching as strangers engaged with truth that might have remained buried if drought and financial hardship hadn't driven him to dig deeper than anyone had before. The presidential medal in his pocket mattered less to him than what he was witnessing. People from diverse backgrounds finding common ground in acknowledging rather than avoiding difficult historical truths. In communities across America implementing the Morgan Protocol, similar scenes were unfolding as residents discovered that honest reckoning with buried histories didn't deepen divisions, as many had feared, but created foundations for collaboration that transcended historical barriers. The failing farm that had driven a desperate search for answers had become the birthplace of a methodology for community healing now recognized as national model. And the elderly farmer who had simply wanted to understand why his land wouldn't grow properly had become an unlikely catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond his fields or lifetime, proving that sometimes the most important contributions come not from those seeking to change history, but from those simply honest enough to acknowledge it, even when the truth has been deliberately buried. 5 years after Elijah Morgan unearthed the buried chest, on his family's farm, he found himself standing before an audience he never could have imagined addressing, the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. At 78, the retired farmer still carried himself with the straightforward dignity that had characterized his approach to the extraordinary events set in motion by his discovery. "I'm just a farmer who wanted to understand why a piece of land wouldn't grow right," he began, repeating the simple introduction that had become almost a mantra as his story reached ever wider audiences. What we found wasn't just old papers. It was truth that had been deliberately buried, truth that needed to come to light not just for our community, but for communities facing similar buried histories worldwide. The international recognition of what was now formally known as the Morgan methodology for historical reconciliation had evolved gradually but powerfully. What began as a local discovery in Clearwater Valley had expanded into a national movement, and now an international framework for addressing historical land appropriation, resource manipulation, and systematic disenfranchisement across continents. Representatives from 27 nations had gathered for this special session on historical justice and contemporary healing, with the Clearwater Valley process serving as the central case study. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples had specifically requested Elijah's participation, recognizing parallels between his discovery and land rights struggles worldwide. The Morgan discovery provides a replicable methodology for communities seeking to address historical injustices without becoming trapped in cycles of accusation and defensiveness, noted the official UN report. Its evidence-based approach, inclusive participation structure, and focus on concrete restoration rather than symbolic gestures offers valuable lessons for international reconciliation efforts. As Elijah concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, he was joined by an expanded delegation that reflected how completely the original discovery had outgrown its beginnings. Robert and Amelia Morgan were there, along with James Washington, Professor Daniels, and Dr. Jenkins. But the delegation now included international partners, indigenous rights advocates from Australia, community leaders from South Africa's land restoration movement, Brazilian environmental justice activists, and representatives from a Canadian First Nations community implementing their own version of the Morgan Protocol. The framework that had emerged from that desperate excavation on a failing farm had proven adaptable across widely different historical and cultural contexts, not as a rigid formula, but as a structured approach to acknowledging buried truths and creating pathways toward concrete restoration. The core principles remained consistent: meticulous documentation, inclusion of marginalized voices, acknowledgement by those benefiting from historical injustice, and tangible commitments to address ongoing impacts. What no one had anticipated when Elijah first discovered the chest was how many similar buried histories existed worldwide, or how urgently communities needed methodologies for addressing them without descending into conflict or empty symbolism. The Morgan discovery had arrived at precisely the moment when global conversations about historical justice were intensifying, providing a practical approach when many had resigned themselves to either perpetual division or superficial reconciliation. Following the UN presentation, the Clearwater Valley delegation participated in a global symposium where community leaders from 5 continents shared their experiences adapting the Morgan methodology to local contexts. The diversity of applications was remarkable, from addressing colonial land appropriation in Kenya to documenting disappeared indigenous communities in Argentina, from restoring diverted water rights in India to acknowledging buried histories of resource extraction in rural Canada. What makes this approach universally applicable isn't the specific historical content, Professor Daniels explained during a panel discussion. It's the process of honest documentation, inclusive participation, and concrete restoration that transcends particular historical circumstances. Dr. Jenkins, whose African American History Institute had expanded to include a Center for Historical Reconciliation Practices, emphasized the psychological dimensions that made the methodology effective across cultures. The Morgan approach succeeds because it addresses both evidence and emotion, he noted. By meticulously documenting what happened while creating structured spaces for processing collective trauma and responsibility, it avoids both the cold impersonality of purely academic approaches and the volatility of unstructured confrontation. For the Morgan family, the international recognition represented both validation and responsibility. What began as a desperate attempt to save their farm had evolved into something with implications far beyond anything they could have imagined. The failing fields that had driven Elijah to excavate the western section now served as living laboratories for both historical acknowledgement and practical restoration techniques being studied by visitors from around the world. Yet even as the Morgan methodology gained international recognition, new challenges were emerging back in Clearwater Valley that would test the resilience of the reconciliation process and reveal both its strengths and limitations. The first challenge appeared unexpectedly through advanced DNA analysis of soil samples from the original excavation site. Environmental scientists studying the area had discovered chemical signatures indicating that industrial waste had been deliberately buried in the western section decades after the original settlement was undermined, another layer of deception that had further compromised the land's productivity. This discovery extended the timeline of deliberate damage from the Reconstruction era through the mid-20th century, implicating additional families and corporations beyond those named. In the original documents, when preliminary findings were presented at a community meeting, tension filled the room as residents realized the historical reconciliation process would need to expand to include more recent and directly relevant actions. The chest documents showed us how water was diverted in the 1860s, explained Dr. Sophia Chen, the environmental scientist leading the investigation. But these soil samples reveal that chemical contaminants were strategically buried in the 1940s and 50s, further ensuring the land would remain unproductive while concealing evidence of industrial dumping. Records suggested that Clearwater manufacturing, owned by the Crawford family during that period, had disposed of chemical byproducts in the already compromised western section, calculating that the land's existing productivity problems would mask additional damage. This deliberate contamination had occurred within living memory, with several elderly community members having worked at the facility during the relevant period. The revelation created immediate tension. While community members had generally accepted historical responsibility for Reconstruction-era actions as something distant ancestors had done, this new evidence implicated parents and grandparents of current residents. Some families who had participated constructively in the reconciliation process now faced uncomfortable questions about more recent actions that couldn't be dismissed as distant history. Harold Crawford, Jr., who had served on the Restoration Trust board and publicly supported the reconciliation process, found his own father's signature on documents authorizing the covert disposal of industrial chemicals. His initial reaction, angry denial, followed by threats to withdraw from the process, entirely threatened to unravel years of careful community building. "This is different," he insisted during a tense council meeting. "We agreed to address historical injustices from the distant past. Now you're accusing our immediate families of environmental crimes based on incomplete evidence. This goes beyond reconciliation into prosecution." The crisis revealed both the strength and vulnerability of the Morgan methodology. Its emphasis on documented evidence meant the new findings couldn't simply be dismissed, while its inclusive structure created space for processing difficult revelations without immediate accusation. Most importantly, its focus on restoration rather than punishment provided pathways forward even as new layers of deception emerged. Elijah Morgan, whose straightforward integrity had anchored the process from the beginning, approached Harold Crawford after the contentious meeting. Their conversation, initially private but later shared with permission as part of the community reconciliation process, demonstrated why the elderly farmer had become such an effective catalyst for healing. "This isn't about assigning blame to your father," Elijah said simply. "It's about understanding what happened to land that's still affecting everyone in this community. The chemicals are still there whether we acknowledge them or not. Denying them won't make the soil any healthier." "It's different when it's your own father being accused," Harold responded, his defensive anger barely containing deeper pain. "Everyone will look at our family differently. Maybe," Elijah acknowledged, "or maybe they'll respect your family more for being honest about difficult truths. That's what this whole process has been about, acknowledging what happened so we can address it properly, not hiding it to protect reputations." This straightforward approach, acknowledging emotional reality while insisting on factual accountability, had characterized Elijah's role throughout the reconciliation process. His lack of political calculation or personal agenda had created space for authentic engagement even with uncomfortable truths. The environmental revelation ultimately strengthened rather than undermined the community process, expanding its scope to include more recent actions while demonstrating its capacity to address multiple layers of historical harm without fracturing hard-won trust. After initial resistance, the Crawford family ultimately contributed additional resources to environmental remediation efforts, acknowledging their predecessors' actions while committing to restoration. This expansion from addressing historical injustice to confronting ongoing environmental impacts represented a significant evolution in the Morgan methodology, creating models for communities worldwide facing similar intersections of historical accountability and present-day environmental justice. The second major challenge emerged, not from new historical evidence, but from the economic transformation triggered by international attention. Clearwater Valley, once a declining rural community struggling to retain population, was experiencing unexpected growth as the new Promise Center attracted researchers, educators, and cultural tourists. Property values in the previously depressed region had doubled within 5 years, creating both opportunity and displacement pressure. New businesses catering to visitors brought employment, but also raised concerns about authentic community voice, potentially being overshadowed by commercial interests, capitalizing on the reconciliation narrative. We need to ensure this remains a living community process, not a commodified story for outside consumption, Teresa Rodriguez warned during a planning commission meeting debating new development proposals. The reconciliation work belongs to everyone who lives here, not just those who can afford rising property values. This tension between economic revitalization and inclusive community ownership represented a challenge that the original Morgan methodology hadn't explicitly addressed. The initial framework had focused on historical acknowledgement and specific restoration actions rather than managing subsequent economic transformation. The solution emerged through the same inclusive process that had characterized the reconciliation work from the beginning. The Restoration Trust, initially established to address specific historical harms, expanded its mission to include community equity provisions, ensuring that economic development benefited original residents and descendant communities, rather than primarily external investors. New policies included affordable housing requirements, local hiring mandates, and business incubation programs specifically supporting ventures owned by community members with historical connections to the area. Most innovative was the Community Heritage Fund that captured a percentage of tourism and development revenue for redistribution to projects maintaining authentic local control of the reconciliation narrative. These economic justice provisions became an integral part of the expanded Morgan methodology, demonstrating how historical reconciliation processes needed to address not just acknowledgement of past harms, but equitable distribution of benefits from the healing process itself. Communities implementing the approach worldwide now incorporated similar protections against reconciliation efforts, inadvertently creating new forms of economic displacement. The third significant challenge emerged from the intersection of historical research and contemporary politics. As the Morgan methodology gained prominence, political figures across the spectrum attempted to either embrace or discredit it based on partisan calculations rather than genuine engagement with its principles. Some conservative politicians characterized the approach as divisive historical revisionism, despite its demonstrated success in building community cohesion. Progressive figures sometimes attempted to claim the methodology exclusively for particular ideological frameworks, potentially limiting its cross-cultural applicability. The Morgan family and their partners responded by firmly maintaining the evidence-based, community-centered nature of the approach, refusing to allow it to be co-opted by any political faction. Their insistence that documented truth transcended political positioning and that genuine reconciliation required participation across ideological divides preserved the methodology's integrity even as it gained prominence in increasingly polarized national conversations. This work isn't about politics, Elijah insisted when pressed to align with particular partisan positions. It's about being honest about what happened and working together to address its ongoing impacts. That's something people across political differences can participate in if they're committed to truth and community well-being. This political independence proved crucial as the methodology spread internationally, allowing it to function in widely different governmental systems and cultural contexts while maintaining core commitments to documented evidence, inclusive participation, and concrete restoration. As the United Nations Symposium concluded, delegates from participating countries drafted the Geneva Framework for Historical Reconciliation, formally incorporating key elements of the Morgan methodology into international best practices. The document acknowledged the elderly farmer from Clearwater Valley as the catalyst for an approach now being implemented across continents. On their final evening in Geneva, the original partners in the discovery, Elijah, Robert, Amelia, James, Washington, and Professor Daniels, gathered for a private dinner overlooking Lake Geneva. The setting couldn't have been further removed from the drought-stricken farm where their journey began, yet their conversation returned to those beginnings. "Did you ever imagine your digging would lead to all this?" James asked, echoing a question that had been repeated countless times over the years. Elijah smiled, his weathered face reflecting both the wisdom of age and genuine humility that had remained unchanged despite international recognition. "I just wanted to understand why that land wouldn't grow right," he replied, as he always did. Turned out understanding required digging deeper than anyone had before, not just into the soil, but into history most people preferred to leave buried. The methodology works because it started with that simple honesty, Professor Daniels observed. Not political calculation or abstract theory, but straightforward determination to understand what was actually happening beneath the surface. As they reflected on the journey from desperate farming crisis to international framework for reconciliation, each recognized how the process had transformed not just communities, but their own understanding of how buried truths could be brought to light without deepening division. What none of them could fully appreciate, even 5 years into this extraordinary journey, was how many similar truths remained buried in communities worldwide, or how urgently those communities needed practical methodologies for addressing historical harms without surrendering to either perpetual conflict or convenient denial. The chest buried on Morgan Farm had preserved not just specific historical documents, but a possibility that transcended its particular contents. The possibility that communities could honestly confront buried historical truths and emerge stronger, rather than more divided. That possibility, nurtured through careful process and genuine inclusion, was now offering hope in contexts far beyond anything Elijah Morgan could have imagined when he first climbed into the excavator cab on that drought-stricken morning 5 years earlier. As the sun set over Lake Geneva, casting golden light across waters that had witnessed centuries of international diplomacy, the unlikely delegates from Clearwater Valley recognized that their work was far from complete. New challenges would continue emerging as the methodology spread to additional communities and confronted different historical circumstances. But the core approach, honest documentation, inclusive participation, and commitment to concrete restoration, had demonstrated remarkable resilience across widely varying contexts. The failing farm that had driven a desperate search for answers had become the birthplace of an approach now recognized in the world's most prestigious diplomatic settings. And the elderly farmer, who had simply wanted to understand poor soil conditions, had catalyzed a movement for historical reconciliation that was creating pathways toward healing in communities that had previously resigned themselves to either perpetual division or superficial forgetting as they prepared to return to Clearwater Valley, now known internationally as a model for rural revitalization through historical honesty. They carried both the validation of global recognition and the responsibility of stewarding an approach that had far outgrown its origins. The buried chest had revealed not just specific historical injustices, but possibilities for reconciliation that communities worldwide were now embracing as they confronted their own buried truths. 10 years after Elijah Morgan unearthed the buried chest on his drought-stricken farm, Clearwater Valley hosted a global gathering unlike anything the once dying rural community could have imagined. The Decade of Reconciliation Conference brought together representatives from over 300 communities across 6 continents, all implementing variations of what was now formally recognized as the Morgan methodology for historical reconciliation. The opening ceremony took place in the most fitting location possible, the western section of the original Morgan farm, now transformed into the international headquarters of the Global Institute for Historical Reconciliation. The formerly unproductive field that had frustrated 3 generations of Morgan farmers had become the epicenter of a worldwide movement, connecting communities, confronting buried histories of land appropriation, resource diversion, and systematic disempowerment. At 83, Elijah Morgan's mobility had decreased, but his mind remained sharp and his perspective clear as he addressed the gathered delegates. Using a cane crafted from wood taken from the original Morgan barn, he walked slowly to the podium, positioned precisely where he had first excavated the buried chest a decade earlier. 10 years ago, I sat in that excavator, he began, gesturing toward a preserved section of the original dig site, now protected under a viewing pavilion. I wasn't looking for history or justice or reconciliation. I was just trying to understand why this land wouldn't grow right after a century of my family's best efforts. He paused, surveying the transformed landscape that now featured restored waterways, archaeological exhibits, educational facilities, and sustainable agriculture demonstration plots, all on land that had once been considered the farm's greatest liability. What we discovered buried here wasn't just documents. It was truth that had been deliberately hidden. Truth that needed to come to light, not just for our family or community, but as it turned out, for communities facing similar buried histories worldwide. The chest contained specific papers about this place, but it also contained something larger, the possibility that facing difficult truths honestly could create healing rather than deeper division. This principle, that communities could emerge stronger rather than more fractured through proper acknowledgement of buried histories, had proven remarkably adaptable across diverse cultural and historical contexts. The methodology that began with one farmer's desperate excavation had evolved into a structured framework, now implemented everywhere, from post-colonial African nations addressing land appropriation to European communities confronting buried histories of wartime collaboration, from Latin American villages documenting disappeared indigenous communities to Asian rural areas addressing forced resource extraction. While each application reflected unique historical and cultural circumstances, the core elements remained consistent. Meticulous documentation of historical evidence, inclusive participation across community divisions, public acknowledgement by those benefiting from historical injustice, and concrete commitments to address ongoing impacts through resource restoration, educational reformation, and economic equity measures. Most remarkably, communities implementing the approach consistently reported decreased polarization around historical issues that had previously seemed irreconcilably divisive. The structured process created pathways for moving beyond both defensive denial and unproductive accusation toward practical actions that benefited community members across historical divides. As Elijah concluded his opening remarks, He introduced the conference's keynote panel, featuring representatives from 5 communities that had adapted the Morgan methodology to widely different contexts. Their diverse experiences demonstrated how completely the approach had transcended its specific origins while maintaining its essential character. Maria Vasquez, from an indigenous community in Guatemala, described using the methodology to document systematic water diversion that had undermined traditional farming practices while creating accountability measures without deepening community division. Dung Moyen from South Sudan presented their adaptation, addressing post-colonial land distribution issues through historical documentation that created pathways for resource sharing rather than continuing conflict. Sato Hiroshi explained how his Japanese fishing village had employed the approach to document industrial contamination, deliberately concealed through historical manipulation of environmental records, creating restoration processes that prevented community fragmentation along political lines. Dr. Elizabeth Coetzee from South Africa discussed their application addressing post-apartheid land reconciliation through an evidence-based approach that transcended both political posturing and oversimplified narratives. Finally, Robert Two Hawks from the Lakota Nation described how their community had adapted the methodology to address both historical federal land appropriation and more recent resource extraction, creating accountability frameworks that engaged multiple stakeholders without sacrificing historical accuracy. What unified these diverse applications wasn't specific historical content, but the methodological approach first demonstrated in Clearwater Valley, the commitment to documented evidence that couldn't be dismissed as political positioning, inclusive participation that prevented any single perspective from dominating the narrative, and concrete restoration actions that moved beyond symbolic gestures to address ongoing impacts of historical harms. As the conference continued through working sessions and field demonstrations, delegates toured the living laboratory that Clearwater Valley had become. The community that had been slowly dying a decade earlier now showcased the transformative potential of honestly addressing buried histories. The new Promise settlement site, once hidden beneath the unproductive western section, had been meticulously excavated and preserved as both memorial and educational resource. Archaeological work had revealed the foundation patterns exactly matching those described in the Freeman Journal, along with artifacts demonstrating the brief period of prosperity before deliberate water diversion undermined the settlement's viability. Most significantly, the diverted spring had been restored to its original course, revitalizing not just the western section, but creating a living demonstration of how resource manipulation had been used as a weapon of economic disempowerment. Visitors could trace the water's path from its source through both its historical diversion channel and its restored original route, experiencing directly how deliberate environmental alteration had shaped community development for generations. Beyond the settlement site, Clearwater Valley itself demonstrated how historical reconciliation could drive community revitalization. The town that had been losing population and economic vitality for decades before the discovery now showcased a different development model, one where acknowledgement of difficult history became the foundation for inclusive growth rather than continued decline. The Clearwater Valley Reconciliation Campus occupied the former Mason estate, its mansion repurposed as a conference center where community groups nationwide came for training in implementing the methodology. Adjacent buildings housed research facilities, document preservation resources, and educational development centers that employed local residents while advancing the worldwide reconciliation movement. Downtown Clearwater, once characterized by Vacant storefronts and declining prospects now featured the heritage district where businesses owned by descendants of both original settlement families and historical community members operated side by side. The restoration market showcased agricultural products from the cooperative farming initiative established on formerly unproductive lands, now returned to sustainable cultivation through restored water access and remediated soil. Most innovative was the Community Heritage Trust, which ensured that economic benefits from reconciliation-driven development were distributed equitably rather than concentrated in the hands of outside investors or privileged local interests. This model of equity-focused revitalization had become as influential as the historical methodology itself, demonstrating how communities could address historical injustices without creating new forms of economic displacement. For the Morgan family, the decade had brought transformations both public and personal. The failing farm that had driven Elijah's desperate excavation had evolved into something none of them could have imagined, not just financially sustainable, but internationally significant as the birthplace of an approach now implemented worldwide. Robert Morgan, once facing foreclosure and the end of his family's agricultural legacy, now directed the Institute's Practical Implementation Division, traveling extensively to help communities adapt the methodology to local conditions. His straightforward farmer's perspective remained essential in translating academic insights into practical community applications. Amelia Morgan had completed her law degree, specializing in historical property claims and environmental justice. A legal framework for addressing documented historical land appropriation had been adopted by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights as a model for remediation processes worldwide. Perhaps most remarkably, James Washington, whose ancestors' land deeds had been among those discovered in the buried chest, had established permanent roots in Clearwater Valley. As executive director of the Global Institute, he provided living testimony to how historical documentation could reconnect descendants with places from which their families had been deliberately displaced. The relationship between the Washington and Morgan families had evolved into something neither could have anticipated, a partnership in stewarding not just specific historical knowledge, but a methodology for reconciliation that transcended their particular experience. Their collaboration symbolized the possibility of healing historical divisions not through forgetting, but through honest acknowledgement and concrete restoration. During a break in the conference proceedings, Elijah Morgan sat with James Washington on a bench overlooking the restored spring that had once been deliberately diverted to undermine the New Promise settlement. The water now flowed freely along its original course, supporting diverse plant communities and agricultural demonstration plots that showcased sustainable farming practices. My great-grandmother described this spring in stories everyone dismissed as confused memories, James remarked, watching the clear water moving through channels exactly matching those documented in the buried chest maps. She said it sang in the morning when sunlight first hit it. I thought that was just poetic language until I heard it myself last summer. That particular sound water makes moving over these limestone formations when morning light warms the surface tension. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. The land remembers even when people try to make it forget. That's what I've learned through all of this. The truth stays there, waiting for someone willing to dig deep enough to find it. This principle, that buried truths remain accessible to those willing to investigate honestly, had proven remarkably durable across diverse contexts. Communities worldwide had discovered that evidence of historical manipulation often remained, preserved in landscape features, architectural patterns, documentary fragments, and oral traditions that gained new significance when examined through a reconciliation framework. As afternoon sessions resumed, delegates participated in specialized workshops addressing particular applications of the Morgan methodology. Environmental. Scientists demonstrated advanced techniques for documenting historical resource manipulation through soil analysis, watershed mapping, and ecological indicators. Legal scholars presented frameworks for addressing documented historical appropriation without creating new forms of injustice. Educators shared curricula for integrating community-specific reconciliation processes into public education without political polarization. The methodology that began with one farmer's desperate excavation had evolved into a sophisticated interdisciplinary framework while maintaining its essential character, the commitment to documented evidence, inclusive participation, and concrete restoration actions. What conference participants found most valuable wasn't the formal presentations, but the lived experience Clearwater Valley provided. The tangible demonstration that a community could confront deeply buried historical truths and emerge more vibrant rather than more divided. Visitors witnessed how the reconciliation process had transformed not just historical understanding, but present reality, creating new economic opportunities, environmental restoration, and social cohesion in a place that had been slowly dying. Before the discovery, on the final evening of the conference, delegates gathered for a community celebration at the restored spring site. As sunset painted the landscape in golden light, representatives from each participating country added water from their local communities to the spring's headwaters, a symbolic gesture connecting their diverse reconciliation journeys to the source where this worldwide movement began. The celebration featured cultural presentations from descendant communities alongside traditional performances from Clearwater Valley's heritage groups, once separate traditions now recognized as interconnected, aspects of a more complete historical narrative. What struck many international visitors was the natural interaction between community members across lines that would have represented rigid divisions before the reconciliation process began. As the gathering concluded, Elijah Morgan watched from a quiet vantage point, his presence acknowledged, but his preference for minimal attention respected. At 83, he had lived to see his desperate act of excavation evolve into something that was helping heal historical divisions worldwide. The failing farm that had driven him to dig deeper than convention allowed had become the birthplace of an approach now recognized by international institutions and implemented across continents. What Elijah Morgan couldn't fully appreciate, even a decade into this extraordinary journey, was how many communities worldwide had been waiting for exactly the methodology his discovery had initiated. In places where historical injustices had seemed either too volatile to address or too entrenched to change, the Morgan approach offered a structured pathway toward reconciliation that avoided both the emotional volatility of unmediated confrontation and the ethical emptiness of convenient forgetting. The chest buried on Morgan Farm had preserved not just specific historical documents, but a possibility that transcended its particular contents, that communities could honestly confront buried historical truths and emerge stronger rather than more divided. That possibility, developed through careful process and genuine inclusion, was now creating pathways toward healing in contexts the elderly farmer from Clearwater Valley could never have imagined when he first climbed into that excavator cab. On a drought-stricken morning 10 years earlier, as delegates prepared to return to their own communities, each carried not just procedural knowledge, but the lived experience of witnessing a place transformed through historical honesty. Clearwater Valley, once a case study in rural decline, had become an internationally recognized model for community-based reconciliation that addressed historical injustices while creating new possibilities for shared prosperity and environmental restoration. What had begun with one farmer's simple determination to understand poor soil conditions had evolved into a global movement for historical reconciliation that was creating measurable positive impacts in communities previously trapped in cycles of division, denial, or unresolved historical trauma. Onday, the conference's final morning, a special ceremony honored both the methodology's origins and its future directions. Representatives from the newest communities implementing the approach, from Arctic indigenous villages documenting climate infrastructure discrimination to European urban neighborhoods addressing buried histories of wartime displacement, received symbolic soil samples from the original excavation site, connecting their work to the place where this journey began. In his closing remarks, James Washington expressed the fundamental insight that had made the Morgan methodology so widely applicable, despite vastly different historical circumstances. What we've learned through this decade of implementation worldwide is that buried truths share common characteristics regardless of specific historical content. They leave traces in landscapes, in documents, in community patterns, and in oral traditions. When we create structured processes for bringing these truths to light, processes that prioritize evidence over ideology, inclusion over domination, and restoration over punishment, communities discover capacity for healing that many had abandoned as impossible. As the international delegates departed, Clearwater Valley returned to its daily rhythm, forever changed by the discovery that had transformed it from dying rural community to international reconciliation center, yet still fundamentally a place where people lived, worked, and now thoughtfully engaged with both their shared history and collective future. For Elijah Morgan, watching from the farmhouse porch that had witnessed both his family's near financial ruin and its unexpected international significance, the decade's journey reinforced a farmer's fundamental wisdom. Truth, like seeds properly planted, grows in its own time when conditions allow. The documents buried in that chest had waited over a century for the right moment to emerge. For someone desperate enough to dig deeper than convention allowed, honest enough to share what they found regardless of consequence, and dedicated enough to steward the reconciliation process that followed. The failing farm that had driven that desperate search had transformed into ground zero for a global movement helping communities worldwide address their own buried histories. And the elderly farmer, who had simply wanted to understand why his land wouldn't grow properly, had become an unexpected catalyst for healing historical divisions across continents and cultures, proving that sometimes the most important truths are those that have waited longest to be heard. As Elijah watched the final conference participants depart, he reflected on the extraordinary journey from crisis to transformation. The chest, buried on Morgan Farm, had contained specific documents about one community's historical injustice, but it had also preserved something far more valuable: the possibility that confronting buried truths honestly could create foundations for healing rather than deeper division. That possibility, nurtured through careful methodology and genuine inclusion, was now offering hope in contexts the elderly farmer from Clearwater Valley could never have imagined when he first discovered that something significant lay buried. Beneath his failing fields, the land remembers, he murmured, repeating the insight that had guided this remarkable decade. It just needs someone willing to listen to what it's trying to tell us. The elderly farmer, who had listened when his land spoke through poor soil and failed crops, had inadvertently launched a worldwide movement for historical honesty and community restoration. And the methodology that emerged from his simple determination to understand what lay beneath the surface had created pathways toward reconciliation in places where such healing had previously seemed impossible, proving that sometimes the most transformative journeys begin not with grand ambitions, but with straightforward questions about why things aren't working as they should. As new groups of visitors arrived for tours of the historical site, Elijah quietly returned to the farmhouse, leaving the telling of this remarkable story to younger voices who would carry it forward. The truth buried on Morgan Farm had waited more than a century to emerge. Now that it had found its voice, it would continue speaking long after those who first discovered it had passed from the scene. The extraordinary legacy of one farmer's desperate excavation had only begun to reveal its full significance, not just for Clearwater Valley, but for communities worldwide, discovering that their own buried truths, properly acknowledged, could become foundations for healing rather than sources of perpetual division. And the methodology that began with a simple determination to understand poor soil conditions had evolved into a global framework for reconciliation that would continue expanding long after its origins in a drought-stricken farm had faded from living memory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.